Committee will please come to order, quorum being present. Before we turn to the markup, there's a matter of committee business we need to address. Before we turn to the markup, there's a matter of committee business to address. Mr. Taylor of Texas has left the committee, leaving open seats on the Subcommittee of Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education and the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions. Mr. Van Drew from New Jersey has joined the committee. I'd like to welcome Mr. Van Drew to the committee, and at the request of the ranking member, ask unanimous consent that he be appointed to fill the vacancies on the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education and the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, left by Mr. Taylor. Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. Now we'll turn to the markup. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 5800, the Banned Surprise Billing Act. Chair announces that any request for recorded votes will be rolled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 13B. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 1, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today we're marking up H.R. 5800, the Banned Surprise Billing Act, a bipartisan proposal to end surprise medical bills and provide comprehensive consumer protections for patients across the country. Surprise medical billing is a troubling and all too common product of our complex healthcare system. These bills occur when a patient with health insurance incurs an unanticipated and frequently significant out-of-pocket expense because, through no fault of their own, they were treated by a provider not covered under their plan. In many cases, victims of surprise billing had no control over whether or not their medical provider was or was not in network. Patients who've suffered severe accidents, for example, may not be capable of choosing which emergency room they go to, but they still must foot the bill. Even those who are careful to avoid out-of-network costs can be hit with surprise bills. For example, a patient undergoing surgery can know that the surgery is covered under their insurance, only to find out that the anesthesiologist in the room was not in network. According to a recent survey, 57% of consumers have received an unexpected medical bill that they thought would be covered by their insurance. Another survey found that 7 in 10 patients who have received unaffordable out-of-network medical bills were unaware that their provider was out of network at the time of care. Consequences of surprise medical bills were not just felt by patients and their families. These high out-of-pocket costs are also a burden on America's employers who share the cost of health insurance with their employees. In fact, this morning I'm entering into the record a new nonpartisan analysis of the surprise billing proposal reported out by the Energy and Commerce Committee. According to this report by the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Energy and Commerce bill will have the effect of increasing workers' wages by curbing health care costs for employers. The legislation we are considering today uses a similar approach, and we expect it to produce a similar result. There is universal agreement on all sides of this debate that patients should be protected from surprise out-of-pocket costs. The Banned Surprise Billing Act is a bipartisan solution. It achieves this goal while being fair to both providers and payers. The bill holds patients harmless by limiting cost sharing and out-of-network costs. It includes bipartisan reforms that improve transparency in health coverage, protects air ambulance patients, and takes steps to address ground ambulance surprise bills, and it provides a two-tier mechanism for resolving payment disputes between providers and payers. For amounts less than or equal to $750, the reimbursement rate would be determined by a market-based benchmark, which is the median in-network rate for providing similar items or services in the same geographical area. For amounts above $750, the providers and payers may elect to use either the benchmark or an independent dispute resolution process to determine a fair payment amount. Surprise medical billing is a contentious and challenging issue that this Congress has been struggling with for the past year. and I understand that there are dissenting views on both sides of the aisle, and I respect the concerns raised by opponents of this approach. But this bill reflects a genuine compromise. By blending the policies put forth by both sides of the debate, it strikes a careful balance that achieves the goal of protecting patients without tipping the scales to either providers or payers. And this approach is bipartisan and bicameral, which makes it likely that it can actually be enacted into law. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a series of letters, one from the AARP that says in part that this bill takes steps in the right direction to address the problem of surprise billing, one from the AFL-CIO, which supports the bill and urges us to oppose any amendments. The AFSCME also protects patients against the most egregious punitive balanced medical bills while keeping the overall health care costs in check. The American Health Policy Institute, which urged us to support the bill and oppose any amendments that would increase the use of arbitration. Families USA led a letter in support of the bill, which says that we should consider makes a recommendation that the best approach is a market-based benchmark rate as the most efficient way to settle payment disputes while holding health care costs down for American families. Such provisions are present in the legislation already passed by the Senate Health Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and is in the legislation considered today by the Education and Labor Committee. That letter is signed by Families USA, AFSCME, Consumer Reports, Doctors for America, Health Access California, Healthcare for America Now, Indivisible, Moms Rising, National Alliance of Mental Illness, National Consumers League, National Partnership for Women and Families, Public Citizen, and Voices for Progress. So I'd ask my colleagues to remember that the status quo is unacceptable. Patients are getting hit with astronomical bills, and both payers and providers are facing an uncertain future. Today, this committee has an opportunity to promote a bipartisan consensus and advance us closer to an actual solution that patients and their families deserve. We must now show our constituents that even tough issues with only imperfect solutions will not stop us from taking action to protect them. I want to thank Dr. Fox and her staff for working with us to find a bipartisan solution, and I hope all of my colleagues will join in supporting the Ban Surprise Billing Act. I now yield to the ranking member, Dr. Fox, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize and thank Brandon Renz, who, after nearly 20 years of government service, will be stepping away from the Committee on Education and Labor. Brandon has served alongside me for more than a decade, and his leadership on this committee and in my personal office will certainly be missed. We don't have time for me to extol his virtues and express to him my full appreciation for his service to our country, but I'll tell you it's a very sad time for me. I hope you'll all join me in wishing him the best as he begins this new chapter in his life. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I think most members on both sides would agree with me that we have days when we wonder, why are we here? I've been thinking a lot about that question in relation to this issue of surprise billing. This is not an issue that should have percolated up to the Congress of the United States. It should have been solved by doctors, hospitals, and insurance companies. They have not. So we're here because patients, our constituents, are being harmed by the very establishments that should have the well-being of patients first and foremost. That well-being should include not surprising patients with bills that they do not expect. This is not right. All the groups protest that they want to, quote, take the patient out of the middle, end quote. They should do just that. They have the means to do that without Congress acting, but they will not, and so we are forced to act. If I sound frustrated, I am. But today, I am reminded why I'm here and why our job as elected members of Congress is so important. Today, we're here to mark up meaningful bipartisan legislation, the Ban Surprise Billing Act, on behalf of the American people. This bill is a result of extensive bipartisan collaboration among several congressional committees and committee Republicans and Democrats. Surprise billing, sometimes referred to as balance billing, occurs when patients, through no fault of their own, face unexpected and sometimes devastating medical bills because they unknowingly receive care outside their insurance network. They can be forced to pay astronomical out-of-pocket costs that they may not be able to afford. Instances such as these can devastate American patients and their families. Examples of surprise billing horror stories abound. CBS this morning recently shared the story of a woman who went in for a routine doctor's visit for a sore throat and faced $28,000 in charges afterwards. In Kaiser Health News, we read about the man who, after emergency kidney failure, was given a $540,000 bill for dialysis treatment. And one of my colleagues shared a story about a constituent who had been in the hospital, and on the way out, her provider suggested she take a simple drug test. She didn't know the test would be sent to an out-of-network lab, or she would face a nearly $18,000 bill. Unfortunately, there are thousands of these troubling and heartbreaking stories. The fear of an unexpected medical bill can be paralyzing, and we don't want Americans foregoing care they need for fear they'll end up responsible for a medical expense they can't afford. So we as lawmakers must step up. We need solutions that equip patients with the information they need to confidently seek treatment without the worry they'll face a huge surprise bill in the future. I'm thankful that my colleagues across the aisle have worked together with committee Republicans to bring us one step closer to achieving our shared goal of shielding Americans from surprise medical bills. That's why I've joined Chairman Scott in introducing the Ban Surprise Billing Act, H.R. 5800. This legislation represents a good faith compromise that is intended to address many challenges and often opposing stakeholder viewpoints on surprise billing. H.R. 5800 also helps ensure this committee, which has sole jurisdiction over ERISA and employer-sponsored health care, has a seat at the negotiating table as Congress works toward a solution to protect families from crippling surprise medical bills. While not perfect, we know that many states have enacted meaningful surprise billing protections for residents covered by individuals and group plans that are regulated at the state level. However, these protections do not apply to workers and their families with ERISA coverage. Unless Congress acts, surprise billing will continue in these plans, and workers, employers, and doctors will continue to suffer. As the Committee of Jurisdiction, it is our duty to act. The Ban Surprise Billing Act moves us in the right direction by holding patients harmless by prohibiting out-of-network providers from sending balanced bills that exceed the in-network rates, protecting air ambulance patients and taking steps to address ground ambulance surprise bills, requiring health plans to maintain up-to-date and accurate provider directories, improving consumer access to information regarding expected cost sharing, and improving transparency regarding in-network and out-of-network deductibles and out-of-pocket limitations. This markup is only one step in a process that involves 4 other congressional committees, and future negotiations will be necessary. If this committee can report H.R. 5800, members who want to participate in the process of providing our constituents relief from surprise medical bills, including those who may disagree with elements of the committee's approach, will have a stronger voice in the final outcome. I've always said I didn't come to Congress to be a bystander. I feel that if we have a chance to help shape public policy, we should not shy away from taking action. In my view, the legislation we're considering today is consistent with this approach. Bottom line, workers and families deserve certainty about their health care coverage. By taking action today, we move one step closer to giving patients financial confidence by lowering costs, expanding choice, and ending surprise billing for insured individuals. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. And I, too, want to recognize Brandon Rentz, who will be departing from his role as Republican Committee Staff Director at the end of the week. Brandon has been a model of professionalism, and although we consider very contentious issues, he has exemplified the idea that we can disagree without being disagreeable. I want to thank him for his hard work over the years and wish him the best for his future endeavors. Thank you. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements for the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require a copy of the measure to be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance, as it was. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill, H.R. 5800, for amendment. The bill was posted electronically in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5800 to end surprise medical billing and increase transparency in health coverage.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. And without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute was distributed electronically in advance of today's markup. I now recognize myself to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute and start off with the amendment in the nature of a substitute makes only minor technical edits to the underlying bill. It includes a GAO study to examine the financial relationships of entities, including those backed by private equity, that use the arbitration process. This is simply a good governance procedure provision added at the suggestion of multiple members of the committee, and that would allow us to fully understand how financial interests are impacting the arbitration system. Again, I want to thank the ranking member for her work in the bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and urge my colleagues to support it and the underlying bill. Are there any members that wish to be recognized for discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentlelady from California.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
When we're considering proposals around surprise billing, I know that we've often just, kind of had a way of looking at it, and often that's been between pitting providers and the insurance companies. But the basic idea here, what's really important is, on this issue is, how does it affect the patient? So we need to be focusing on the patient. In my home state of California, surprise billing legislation was virtually eliminated by stopping out-of-network doctors from billing or collecting more than the in-network cost sharing. By having a strong network adequacy protections, they assure that a consumer receives the care they need when they need it. That's what we want. For the 4 health plans that account for almost 90% of the commercial state-regulated insurance market in California, over 80 to 95% of their contracted facilities yielded no billing by out-of-network doctors. So we want to look at the results as well in terms of provider availability. Specifically, for one large insurer, since AB 72, the bill that addressed this issue, went into effect, the overall number of physicians contracted with has increased by 5%. At acute care hospital facilities specifically, the number of in-network physicians increased by 6%. And the number of anesthesiologists is one particular specialty that we've all been focusing on. The in-network anesthesiologists increased by 6.7%. So at the end of the day, we have to protect patients from surprise bills, and I think that what California has shown is that it's possible to do that. I certainly applaud our colleagues in the Ways and Means Committee and also everyone here on the committee that has advocated generally for that position, but I think that their proposal adds an unnecessary level of complexity and uncertainty for consumers. If the insurance company foots the bill, then the premiums are going to go up. We've seen that in a number of places. It's a simple math question. We have seen premiums go down, however, in what is the largest and diverse state in our country, California. This is not about supporting insurance companies. It is about supporting patients, however, and I hope that we'll have that opportunity in this discussion today to keep our focus on what's important here, and that's the patient. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am strongly opposed to this legislation that we're considering today. All of us, every single member on this committee and every member of Congress wants to do one thing we all agree on, which is to hold the patient harmless. Hold the patient harmless. Take them totally out of the equation. And we all share a desire to end surprise medical billing, which causes patients unnecessary stress and financial worry. And that's why every bill that's been introduced to deal with this problem completely protects the patient. The question before us today is whether we'll simply give the insurers the ability to set rates or whether we'll look for a shared solution that allows providers and payers to negotiate for the fair value of what their services cost. Make no mistake, if we pass today's bill unamended, patients will see reduced access to care. By 2030 in this country, we're going to be 120,000 doctors short. The bill being considered today is fundamentally anti-free market and anti-provider, and I don't believe for 1 second the idea that allowing the government to fix prices is consistent with the American spirit. Here's an example of how this bill will play out in the real world. Today, already, insurers are reviewing the data in each local market to determine who is the highest cost physician, not the highest quality, the highest cost, and they're dropping them from networks. Why? Well, they're driving this so-called locally negotiated rate as soon as possible for these services. The bill then denies physicians the one true negotiating tool that they have, the ability to say no to rate insurers have offered them. It doesn't have to be this complicated. I've been working with a bipartisan coalition of members who are using a proven model that has been adopted in many states that uses arbitration to resolve the differences between providers and payers. Arbitration favors no one, and indeed the data backs this up. A Georgetown University Health Policy Center and Health Insurance Reform study from May of 2019 shows that as of October 2018, the New York IDR process saw 618 decisions in favor of health plans and 561 favored by the provider. It's a fair and balanced approach, and its utilization has not impacted insurance premiums over that time frame. Our bill provides for commercially reasonable payment from insurer to provider within 30 days and then establishes the independent dispute resolution system if the two parties can't agree on the final payment. It uses baseball-style arbitration. The arbiter can pick one or the other. This system's been working in New York for nearly 5 years and has data to support this approach. Instead, with this bill, we're trying to invent a new federal system. I can guarantee you this system will have unintended consequences. And I want to note something else. Over the past 6 months, Congresswoman Shalala, Congressman Morelli, and others, and I've offered repeatedly to work with the chairman and ranking member to find common ground and reach a balanced solution. They have not only not offered to work on improving this bill, they refused to even meet with us until last night. And I wish we could have sat down. We had a wonderful discussion last night. And I wish every member of the committee could have been there and heard what was said. And as a former chairman of a major committee myself, I know how members should be treated. I will note that in the Ways and Means tomorrow, a bill will be marked up that's a significant improvement over this legislation. And unlike this bill, it has not tipped the scales in negotiating to one side or the other, but instead seeks to allow two sides in a payment negotiation a fair opportunity to reach an equitable solution. If this bill passes a committee today, we should immediately shelve this solution and instead take up the much better product from Ways and Means as a base bill. I had planned to offer amendments today to improve the bill to be fair to both sides. I encourage my colleagues on the committee to support the amendments offered by those of us who've worked to reach an equitable bipartisan solution. We can all agree that surprise medical bills should be eliminated. I've had one personally. As a doctor, I saw patients that got them, and patients should be taken out of the middle. And what many on this committee already agree with, we should be done through a system that uses the IDR process. Let me very quickly, in my last 30 seconds, say this. This is simple. You have two parties that negotiate a solution. If they can't come to a resolution, the patient doesn't even know this is going on, it goes to an IDR process. You pick one side or the other. It's been used for 5 years successfully in New York and doesn't do federal price setting. Mr. Chairman, I appreciated the last night, the dialogue we had together. I very much appreciated that. And again, I wish the entire committee could have heard the discussion we had. I yield back.
Thank you, and I'll ask unanimous consent that an article published in National Public Radio entitled "To End Surprise Medical Bills, New York Tried Arbitration, Healthcare Costs Went Up," that be entered into the record. I think we had two Democrats on this side, so we'll have two Democrats now. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
I thank the chairman. The harmful practice of surprise billing leaves American workers and families with uncertainty and apprehension about how to meet their health care costs or just how to get through the process. My family has dealt with this for the last year and a half and still going to try to conclude a surprise medical billing issue. So there's a need to find solution for all of us. According to a recent survey, 57% of consumers report they have received an unexpected medical bill that they thought would be covered by their insurance. Additionally, another survey found that 7 in 10 patients who've received unaffordable out-of-network medical bills were unaware that their provider was out-of-network at the time they received the services. Rightfully so, surprise medical bills are the leading health care concern for Americans, surpassing worries about high premiums, high deductibles, and rising drug costs. There is some good news. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that legislative action is needed to address this growing and troubling issue. Today, a bill that, while not perfect, it is significantly better than kissing your sibling. We are considering this bill, the Ban Surprise Billing Act, H.R. 5800, bipartisan legislation that provides important consumer protections for Americans who receive health care coverage through their employer and for those enrolled in the individual market. In fact, H.R. 5800 is very similar to the December 2019 agreement between Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee Chairman Alexander, House Energy Commerce Committee Chairman Frank Pallone, and Ranking Member Walden. The White House has also expressed support for that proposal. It's important to note, as Congress continues working out a solution to protect families from the devastating hazards of surprise billing, that this committee has sole jurisdiction over employer-sponsored health care. Nearly 160 million individuals depend on employer-sponsored health care. A majority of employer-sponsored plans are self-insured under the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. This type of coverage is critical to nearly 110 million workers and their families. And ERISA grants employers the flexibility to meet their workers' needs and retain their workforce. While several states have worked to address surprise billing, self-insured employer-sponsored plans that cover are not subject to state rules and protections, including surprise billing clauses. In creating a legislative solution to end the practice of surprise billing, we recognize that ERISA protections for self-insured plans must be preserved by remaining subject to federal law. Granting employers the flexibility to continue offering high-quality health coverage is good for employers and employees all around. I want to remind my colleagues that this markup is only one step in a process that involves 4 other congressional committees. Future negotiations will be necessary, but by passing this legislation today, we ensure that all members who want to participate in the process of providing our constituents relief from surprise medical bills, including those who may disagree with elements of the committee's approach, will have a stronger voice in the final outcome. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Washington, Dr. Schreier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. So first of all, I just want to commend the committee for taking up the issue of surprise billing. It is so important. I think we can all agree that we need to protect the patient. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you are a patient, you go to an in-network hospital, but lo and behold, the emergency doctors are contract doctors, and they're not covered by your insurance. And so you could then be hit with a surprise bill from the emergency room doc. Not just that, if that doctor thinks you might have appendicitis and you have an ultrasound or CT scan done and the radiologist isn't covered, you could get another surprise bill from that radiologist. And not just that, if you go on to have an operation and say the surgeon is covered because it's an in-network hospital, but the anesthesiologist isn't, you could get another surprise bill. And that is why this legislation is so important, because no patient who goes in good faith to an emergency room at a hospital that is in network should get hit with this kind of bill. So first of all, thank you. Now, there are 4 committees who are taking this up, and I think that although this is a good attempt, that we can do better. Mr. Chairman, you spoke about wanting to strike the right balance and not put a thumb on the scale. But this bill, as written, really does put a thumb on the scale. Because when you say that the reimbursement should be at the median in-network price, we have to think about what will happen down the line. So for example, if you know that you're going to be paying the in-network price for an out-of-network anesthesiologist and you're an insurance company, what you're probably going to do is narrow your network to only the doctors who you pay the least to, pushing down that in-network price and then undercutting the hospitals and the doctors who you would otherwise be paying in-network. Let's also talk about what happens to networks. All of a sudden now, half of those doctors who were in the network are no longer in the network, resulting possibly in even more patients getting hit with out-of-network bills. This essentially puts the control in the hands of the insurance companies because they control the size of the networks and they then control what they pay. And that puts our rural hospitals, our teaching hospitals, our children's hospitals at risk. This essentially becomes a choice between whether you are going to just let doctors and insurance companies work this out in a neutral way, or whether you're going to put a thumb on this scale that benefits insurance companies and does nothing more to protect patients. A reminder, patients are protected in any one of these bills. They are left harmless, they're out of the picture, they only pay what they would have paid in network. They're protected either way. So the question is what then happens with our networks, what happens with doctors' fees, and how much our rural hospitals who are already hanging on by a thread will suffer if reimbursement rates go down. And so we have several amendments to present that will improve this bill, that will take away the benchmarking of prices, and I think that would be a marked improvement to this bill. I will reserve the rest of my time, but I ask for you to consider those amendments. Thank you.
The gentlelady, yield back. Yield back.
Yes, I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know that there are areas here, obviously, where we all agree. As a dentist, I know a lot of physicians. I've seen a lot of situations through my 30-some years of practice myself. And I will tell you that surprise billing can be one of the most horrible, awful things that can happen to a family or an individual, where literally they are virtually bankrupted and their credit is ruined and they have a tremendous amount of issues financially because of something that was not their fault, something they didn't expect, and quite frankly, something that shouldn't have happened. I also have to, to be very candid, say that we all just can't, assume that insurance companies are perfect and are always our friends. No offense to anyone who is here, but that is the reality. Insurance companies are there to make a profit. And in that scope of what's being done here, that makes this a serious issue in what we're doing. Arbitration is good. The New York model is good. The New York model generally works. Most people on both sides of the equation are happy with it. Folks are generally happy with arbitration, including the docs, and I think it's something that should have been looked at more seriously. The other issue here is we sure didn't have a lot of time, and I certainly respectfully don't blame anyone. I know how these things work, to really study this bill, discuss it, work with physicians and insurance companies and folks on all sides. I know it has elements of the other bills, but still this was a surprise, at least to some of us. There are a number of other bills that are in the hopper that I think address this more correctly and more fairly for both sides of the equation. Rural hospitals are going to be at a risk. Teaching hospitals are going to be at a risk. There are going to be serious issues with this. And, sometimes there's a thought, well, if we really squeeze the docs, everything is good because, and I'm going to be very blunt, they make a lot of money, so you can squeeze the daylights out of them and it's not going to hurt the patients. That's just wrong. Docs leave, they go to other areas, they won't perform certain types of procedures anymore. There's a whole host of economic indicators that occur when you do things like this, and you also have a situation where down the road, care does not get better, but it gets worse. This is such a serious issue. I would say there's 2 points I would make. One is that we do need to do it rapidly. We can't be going on for years and years and years with this. But I would say the second issue is we have to do it right. And I know everybody keeps saying this is not perfect. I understand it's not perfect. I understand that no legislation is perfect. But when it comes to health care, you want to try to get it as perfect as you possibly can. And I think that there's a couple of other bills that get it more perfect. So, I have real concern with this, and I hope that there will be amendments that will come forward that are going to, in some ways, substantively change this, particularly with arbitration as being the main model. And I'm just going to say openly and outwardly that I would support those amendments. Chairman, I thank you for the time, and I yield back for now.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We know that surprise billing is a challenging issue that can devastate families. We all have heard from either our own friends and family or constituents, but one thing is abundantly clear. It's outrageous that someone in need of emergency medical attention or someone who seeks care with the understanding that their insurance will cover the cost would find themselves through no fault of their own facing exorbitant bills from an out-of-network provider. We all agree that we need to solve that issue. Providing excellent care is a driving motivation of our wonderful nurses, doctors, surgeons, specialists, and we know that they want to be practicing medicine, not dealing with complicated bureaucracy or worrying about their bottom line. Unfortunately, our healthcare system and the ways we pay for it are simply broken. If and when we solve surprise billing, this system will still be too expensive, too complicated for too many Americans. We must do more to protect patients and support care providers who would rather be serving those who need it most than filling out paperwork and fighting claims. The legislation we're considering today is a small but important step in the right direction, but we absolutely need to do more. I appreciate my colleagues on this committee who have worked so hard on this issue, and the chair and the ranking member and everyone who's working to solve this issue. And I do want to follow up. I know Chairman Scott introduced into the record the NPR story from November of 2019. And again, with all due respect to my colleagues who I know work on this issue from New York, according to an analysis of data from the New York's Department of Financial Services, the New York model is making healthcare substantially more expensive in the state. Arbiters are typically deciding on dollar amounts above the 80th percentile of typical costs. We have to solve this issue, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues on broader reforms that truly improve access, address the drivers of costs, and advance health care for all as a human right. Our communities and our economy do better when everyone has access. So again, I appreciate the work that's been done on this. This is a one step in the right direction, but it's not going to solve the overall problem of our healthcare system. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address the committee for 5 minutes.
That's a 5 minute.
I want to applaud our committee for taking up an issue which really, to be very honest, is one that is long overdue in the medical community. You know, I've seen this firsthand where patients have been transferred with air ambulances coming in extremis. They don't have a choice as to who their provider is. They're provided care immediately and expediently to save their life, and by all means, they should not seek the repercussion or not feel the repercussions of an out-of-network provider being much more expensive. So I applaud any legislation that basically takes the patient out of this equation. This is what we're doing here. This is what we're here. We're here to protect patients. I will say this, and I will stand in vehement opposition to rate setting. And let me explain really what this means as far as setting rates. We have an arbitration model that works. We should not give the keys to the kingdom, if you will, to either side. We shouldn't give it to insurance companies. We shouldn't give it to providers. But if you rate set and you pick an arbitrary number, $750, then there is literally no impetus for any insurance company to pay more than that. They will drive down anything that costs more than $750 to $750, and if providers, hospitals do not accept that, then all of a sudden you're out of network, which will then drive down median payments. And I will tell you the collateral effects of rate setting on private practice, which is the most efficient mechanism of delivery of health care in this country, will be, and this is not alarmist, will be catastrophic. Because what it will do, it will take folks that bring patients in at a moment's notice, and really deliver the most efficient care. It will drive them out of business. And where do they go? They will then go to be employed by hospitals and larger institutions, where it has been documented that individuals and physicians who work for hospitals end up costing the medical system much more than those individuals in private practice. So then we drive individuals from the most efficient part of medicine to the most inefficient part of medicine. And then secondly, we are experiencing a horrible physician shortage, especially in specialists in this country. And what this will do, it will finally, after so many continuing burdensome regulations over the last 15 to 20 years, individuals will throw their hands up and quit. And will further exacerbate the shortages that this nation is about to experience in the next 5 years. I will also tell you what rate setting does to teaching hospitals, what it does to rural hospitals. These are suffering far extreme issues right at this moment in time in this country. If we rate set, then these institutions who are teaching our future doctors, these institutions who are hanging on by a thread in rural areas to take care of those who cannot get access to medicine in big cities, will further degrade their ability to provide care to these individuals. So I will tell you there are so many different collateral effects of any rate setting. I don't want the keys of the kingdom to go to either group. We have a model in New York, actually, that's worked well. We have arbitration. Rates have not gone up more than 1% over the last 5 years. We have a model that has worked. So I applaud the committee for taking up this very, very necessary issue, but I will say that we have to get it right because the effects of this legislation, if not done correctly, could be devastating to the practice of American medicine in the United States. Thank you. I will yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you,
Recognized for
Mr.
5
Chairman,
minutes.
and I'll be very brief. Again, I just want to applaud yourself and the ranking member for doing the hard blocking and tackling that it takes to actually move a bill on a bipartisan basis. And obviously, this is a issue we had a hearing on last year, and which should be probably about the lowest hanging fruit in terms of healthcare reform, in terms of dealing with this very concrete issue that everybody understands is unacceptable in terms of what's happening to patients out there. As long as we're comparing notes in terms of different states, I would just share with you that in the state of Connecticut, the legislature passed a surprise billing legislation that is a benchmark system. It isn't exactly the same benchmark that's used in the compromise here today, but basically the way it works is that if there's a disputed surprise bill, reimbursement for emergency services in particular is set at the highest of three. The Medicare rate, the in-network rate, or 80 percentile Fair Health Database, which is an index that is done by a nonprofit across the country. And it is more generous than in-network reimbursement, but it is clearly a benchmark, and it has been operating, again, with state-regulated health insurance plans with no pushback in terms of the provider community, and certainly none of the negative consequences that we've heard here in terms of, impact on healthcare workforce or, hospital solvency that's happening here. So again, I think the notion that a benchmark system is inherently going to be damaging to the access of care and healthcare professions, I think we have specific examples, whether it's California, which my colleague Ms. Davis described, or Connecticut, that actually shows, in fact, it can work. And I would just also note that, last night we did hear from a lot of patient groups who are hardly stooges of the insurance industry, like Families USA, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, National Consumers League, Public Citizen, and Consumer Reports, that all endorsed the compromise that we're about to vote on here today. So these are groups that represent patients. They care about healthcare access. They care about quality of healthcare, and they have looked at this compromise and determined that, in fact, it did strike a solid balance in terms of making sure that we're going to protect patients from surprise billing. We're going to give some safety valve for higher cost bills in terms of going through the arbitration process, but that we can have a clean benchmark system that simplifies the way to resolve this system without turning it into baseball arbitration in really countless numbers of instances. So again, I support the amendment in nature of substitute, and again salute the compromise that our leaders on both sides of the aisle have worked out in this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard? Gentleman from Georgia, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think we're all in agreement that something has to be done about surprise medical bills. It is a big problem in the country. It's a big problem in Georgia. And, obviously we've got to do this the right way. I do have serious concerns with this legislation. I have spent a lot of time talking with providers in my district, and they have serious concerns with this legislation. We basically arrived at the decision, and I'm a co-sponsor of the Roe-Roos arbitration model. Like I said, I don't know what works for Connecticut or other states, but this seems to work for New York. It seems to work for Texas. And I think under this model, patients are held harmless for unanticipated costs arising from emergency care or care where they reasonably have believed that the care they received was in network. If providers and insurers cannot agree on a payment rate, they must engage in an independent dispute resolution process. We cannot go in the direction of rate setting. The Ways and Means Committee has released a proposal just last week, which includes a mediation process for when insurers and out-of-network providers can agree on a payment rate. I believe the Ways and Means Committee proposal and the Roe-Roos model are a step in the right direction. I will be voting no unless there are fundamental changes to H.R. 2800. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Thank you for holding this markup. Throughout our debate today, I hope that we don't lose sight of the fact that unless Congress acts, surprise bills will continue to affect 1 in 6 people every year. That is more than 10,000 families every day. Put another way, 1 in 5 emergency department visits and about 9% of elective inpatient care at in-network health facilities results in a surprise bill. So we can wring our hands, we all have these stories, but ultimately the question is, are we going to stand up for the status quo or are we going to make a change? All of this discussion about surprise billing comes in the context of overall healthcare costs in the United States that continue to increase dramatically. According to a new study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, the United States spends an average of $2,479 per patient solely on administrative costs, compared with $551 per capita under Canada's single-payer system. That's a total price tag of $817 billion on healthcare administrative costs in 2017. Those administrative costs now make up about 34% of our nation's total healthcare expenditures, which, by the way, we will spend $55 trillion on healthcare costs over the next 10 years if we stick with the status quo. So these cost burdens, and yes, profit motives of multiple actors that exist in our healthcare system today are driving up costs for everyone, and surprise billing is a piece of that. I believe that arbitration just adds in another layer of administrative costs to our healthcare system. In states that have passed laws allowing arbitration, administrative costs are actually going up. One example, in one state that uses arbitration, those arbitration costs are $395 per claim. When you consider that there are 12 million out-of-network emergency room bills in the country each year for people with private insurance, applying these fees to every surprise bill would increase healthcare costs by $4.7 billion annually. Policy approaches that focus on arbitration do very little to limit the growing influence of profit-making private equity firms and exorbitant provider profits at the expense of whom? Of our constituents that need health care and need a system that puts patients over profits. According to an analysis of newly released data from New York's Department of Financial Services, the New York model is making healthcare substantially more expensive in the state. And New York's guidance tells arbiters to determine charges based on dollar amounts that are 80% higher than typical costs. Mr. Chairman, I believe that our whole healthcare system needs to be reformed, and we need to fight against the current status quo. That's why I've introduced a Medicare for All bill that would take the profits out of our healthcare system and ensure that we change the balance towards our consumers. As we consider surprise billing legislation, our goal should be to bring down costs for everyone. And the best policy solution for that is to discourage surprise billing itself by ensuring that specialty providers are reimbursed at rates equivalent to in-network providers delivering the same services rather than merely passing along sky-high bills to other actors in the healthcare system. In doing so, we can protect patients, eliminate the role of predatory private equity firms, and slow the growth of overall healthcare spending. I will support, somewhat reluctantly, this bill because I think that we need to move in the correct direction. But I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, if we continue to undermine the compromises that were already made, remember that the Senate Help Committee passed a bill out of that committee in a bipartisan, extremely bipartisan vote, 20-3, and we are still continuing to undermine some of those reforms. Now, I think that this bill is closer to the Energy and Commerce bill that was another compromise that lowered the arbitration threshold, but it will be very difficult to continue to support a bill that continues to undermine efforts to protect patients. And I think if we get closer to an arbitration-style model, if we continue to lower the threshold, that will make it impossible for some of us to actually support a bill because ultimately we want to make sure that we are protecting patients. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work, and I thank the ranking member But I hope that we do not continue to undermine a solution that actually fixes this massive problem of surprise billing.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I do.
Could you remind us how much arbitration there was in the Senate Help Bill?
There was zero arbitration in the Senate Help Bill.
Thank you. Yield back. Gentlelady yields back. The others wish to comment. Mr. Sablon, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member and all of those who worked on this bill on HR 5800, bringing it forward. I'm very grateful that the outlying areas, the insular areas, the territories were included in coverage. As the bill moves forward and the three separate bills some efforts are done to sort of consolidate the bills from the three committees of jurisdiction, there may be a chance for me to look closely at how I could work on the issue of air ambulance because from where I come from, and this is from personal experience, when we had to get a charter air ambulance to bring my brother-in-law to a hospital in Manila, and the cost was just like, wow, I had no idea. Number two, I was listening to Mr. Wahlberg because I have personal experience now. I got a surprise billing myself. I, of course, chose to go to one hospital so that all my records are there, all my billings are. But I had no idea that a provider in this hospital setting actually was out of network. And I had to make a phone call to this company, because they were close to sending this letter to collection agency. And I said, wait, hold a minute, let's talk about this. It's not that I don't want to pay, I want to find out if I actually owe this amount. But this is up, Mr. Chairman. It may not be perfect, but this is a great bill that I support, and I thank everyone involved in putting it together, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The others wish to comment on the bill? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
That's 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been working on the issue of surprise medical billing for many years now, first as a state legislator leading the New York State Assembly Insurance Committee, and then as majority leader of the New York State Assembly, and I helped craft New York's landmark surprise billing law that went into effect 5 years ago and has served as a model for several other states. And I would just note parenthetically that the New York State law has saved New York patients $400 million in surprise bill, has actually increased network participation by doctors in New York, and has not been cited by a single insurance plan or health plan as a rationale or reason for premium increases. I'm incredibly passionate about this issue. I'm grateful that the House is working to protect patients across the nation, no matter how they get their health coverage. And despite disagreements on policy specifics, I am grateful that Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Fox have brought forward legislation that will hold patients harmless for unplanned out-of-network health care services. And there are areas of agreement. We all know a dire medical emergency is no time to check your health plan's directory for in-network providers, and the law shouldn't expect patients to play detective just to discover if their radiologist or anesthesiologist is in or out of their plan's network. There are many aspects of surprise billing policy that we do agree on. We agree that no American should receive an unexpected medical bill that could bankrupt their families. We agree on common-sense patient protections, like requiring up-to-date provider directories and accessible information about patient cost obligations. We even agree on the need for an unbiased, independent dispute resolution process to help providers and plans resolve payment disputes. However, I firmly believe that the benchmarking rate-setting model contained in this legislation before us today will have dramatic, harmful consequences for American patients, for America's hospitals, and our nation's healthcare system as a whole. And I note, with respect to my friend Mr. Courtney from Connecticut, Connecticut has a far more generous system than New York does for providers, because in their benchmark, they have the 80th percentile, something New York does not have. Hospitals in particular will face significant negative impacts that will bring us back to this issue again and again and again in the future. Let's avoid unintended consequences, which will almost certainly result in the disruption of networks and harm our nation's hospitals. Because of those concerns, I will be offering amendments today that will help this committee move to a balanced approach to avoid harming access to care without increasing costs for patients, without increasing costs to the United States government, and without increasing costs to American citizens. I yield back.
Time has expired. Others wish to speak to the amendment? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased that we're taking up this critical bill in our full committee today, and I hope that we all have the same goal: protecting patients from financial pain. We're here this morning to advance legislation that will end surprise medical billing, a very serious issue that has disrupted and devastated the lives of so many in our nation. The Health Subcommittee that I chair held a hearing in April about this important issue entitled Examining Surprise Billing, Protecting Patients from Financial Pain. That hearing brought into focus the devastating effects of surprise or balance billing on many, many Americans. As we all have learned, surprise medical bills occur when patients covered by health insurance are subject to higher than expected out-of-pocket costs for care received from a provider who is outside their plan's network. At my hearing, we heard about one infamous case where a young San Francisco woman named Nina Dang suffered a severe bike accident. She was barely lucid when a bystander called an ambulance that took her to an emergency room at a nearby hospital. Before she knew it, doctors had done x-rays and scans and put her broken arm in a splint and then sent her on her way. A few months later, Nina was hit with a $20,000 medical bill because the hospital, which she did not choose, was an out-of-network facility. Needless to say, she was devastated. These kinds of stories are all too common. A March 2019 Money Watch report recounted a Texas man who was billed $108,951 when he was taken to an out-of-network hospital following a heart attack. A Vermont skier paid $18,442 in hospital bills after she broke her leg on the slopes. Then there's the $18,000 urine test from an out-of-network lab. According to a recent survey, 57% of consumers report that they have received an unexpected medical bill and that they thought would be covered by their insurance. This is a very complex issue, but there is one principle that should be at the heart of any final bill. Consumers must be held harmless, and surprise billing must end. That's why our hearing was called Protecting Patients from Financial Pain. I'm pleased that this bill addresses that principle. Importantly, patients will be taken out of the middle of billing disputes and will not be sent a bill. Additionally, an out-of-pocket cost for patients will be limited to their in-network rate. With that provision, we will protect patients from financial pain as the Health Committee promised. I'm pleased that this is a bipartisan bill, and I commend both Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Fox for working together on this important issue. Amendments that will make it an even better bill should be considered today. I look forward to continuing to work with all parties to protect consumers from surprise billing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Do the others wish to be heard? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say to you and the ranking member that I appreciate the discussion that we had last night. I wish we had had it earlier, but it was an excellent discussion. I'd like to reluctantly note my opposition to the approach that this committee is taking to end surprise medical bills. We all agree that we must end surprise billing and protect patients. There is not a bill out there that doesn't protect patients. However, I fear that the committee's bill will create more problems as it seeks to solve the problem of surprise billing. The committee's bill essentially codifies into law insurance company dictated prices as the payment rate for surprise bills. If this becomes law, we will start to see narrower networks as insurance companies push providers, including hospitals, out of network. And we will see doctors and hospitals coming back to Congress every year or every 2 years asking for help with inadequate payments. This is not a fight Congress should be inserting itself into. Let me repeat. We all agree that the patient should be held harmless. There is not a single member of Congress that I know that doesn't want that. What we disagree on is who should pay the bill and how much they should pay once the patient has been taken out of the equation. I believe that where you have powerful parties on either side, in this case, doctors and hospitals on one side and insurance companies and large employers on the other side, that we should set up a system where neither party is unfairly advantaged, and we should let them work it out. Mr. Chairman, I've spent a lot of years in healthcare, and my colleagues across the aisle will not be surprised that sometimes I've believed strongly in the heavy hand of government. In this case, I believe in a very light hand. I believe that this bill unfairly tips the scale in favor of the health insurance companies by telling doctors and hospitals they'll get paid medium contract rate from health insurance plans and that they can only challenge that if the unpaid claim is above a certain dollar threshold. You're placing the power in the insurance company's hands. They are the only entity that know what exactly the median network is. Only insurance companies know how much they pay each doctor or hospital in the area. The doctor and the hospital don't have access to that information. And there's no doubt that they'll find ways to game this system. The committee's bill asks my Republican colleagues to support government rate setting in the private sector and asks my Democratic colleagues to take money from their local hospitals and give it to insurance companies. It asks us all to hurt rural hospitals, teaching hospitals, children's hospitals. I know people care about bending the cost curve in the healthcare sector. We all do. Those of you who have been in Congress longer than me remember the SGR, or the doc fix. Congress overrode those cuts 17 times and finally repealed the SGR in 2015. Ham-handed attempts to bend the cost curve become a congressional Christmas tree, fixes and deficit busters year after year. I will remind this committee that just recently we repealed the health insurance tax at a cost of $150 billion. That is $150 billion to the insurance companies. This bill is going to be another big gift to those same companies. I believe that there's a more balanced bill out there to solve the problem of surprise medical bills while still reducing the cost of premiums and saving the federal government money. The Ways and Means bill is better balanced. It's not tipped in favor of anyone, and it's disliked by everyone. I'm a co-sponsor of it, and I will continue to fight for its ultimate passage. But more important than anything else, we need something really balanced here, and I will support the amendments that my colleagues will propose.
Thank you, gentlelady's time has expired. Does anyone else wish to speak? Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Fox for tackling an issue that hits so close to home for so many families, including my own. Despite the name, the issue of surprise billing has become quite familiar to me and my family. And I've spoken before about this. My two oldest sons both have Crohn's disease, and we have faced bills that no family should come home to, even with excellent health insurance. Right here is one of the bills we've gotten. These are things I could find last night. One of my sons got an intestinal blockage while he was out of state. This bill was for over $600, $602.27. On that same trip, there was an air ambulance bill for tens of thousands of dollars and other hospital bills in the thousands of dollars. I wish I could say that that was a unique incident for our family, or that those were the highest bills we've ever gotten, but they weren't. Here's another bill from one of my sons that says your total balance is $25,635.43 from another time. I mean, no normal family can pay these bills, Mr. Chairman, and it's a crisis for our country. When your child is sick, all you want is for them to get better. I don't know a single parent who wouldn't trade anything to make that happen. But when bills like this arrive, what kinds of trade-offs are we asking people to make? Late mortgage payments, skipping a trip to the grocery store, skipping health care for themselves for the sake of their kids, which won't do their kids much good in the long run if the parent isn't well to take care of them. We have to stop these surprise bills so that American families aren't forced to make these choices. And I'm really grateful to you and Ranking Member Fox for recognizing this and working so hard to come up with a comprehensive bipartisan solution. This bill basically takes an approach that we've seen work, setting a benchmark for provider payments. A 2016 California law took this same approach, and despite attacks from special interests claiming otherwise, the New York Times reported late last year that the law was protecting patients without constraining access to health care. California's Department of Managed Health Care said, and I'm quoting, "We have not seen evidence indicating negative impacts for consumers' access to care as a result of this new law." Ideally, Mr. Chairman, I would have liked to see a bill that relies entirely on a benchmark approach. And I've also made no secret of my strong support for a Medicare for All system in which issues like out-of-network bills would cease to exist altogether. We've got to have the imagination and the courage to change our system so that families aren't subjected to the huge costs of surprise bills, premiums, co-pays, and so on and so forth that are bleeding families so that they can't achieve the American dream. However, this is a good step forward. It's going to help patients, and in the name of making progress, I'm happy to vote in favor of this bill as it comes out of committee. I want to thank you and the Ranking Member again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Anyone else to speak to the bill? Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I point out that we all know that healthcare costs are too high, and the harmful practice of surprise billing gives American workers and families more uncertainty and apprehension about how to meet these costs, and patients deserve access to clear information about their health care coverage. The Ban Surprise Billing Act that we have before us today is the product of extensive collaboration involving several congressional committees on behalf of American families, and brings us one step closer to achieving our shared goal of shielding Americans from surprise medical bills. This bipartisan bill represents a good faith compromise to address the demonstrated and growing problem of surprise medical billing and to help patients and consumers. The bill is also intended to address many challenging and often opposing stakeholder viewpoints on surprise billing. The bill also helps ensure this committee, which has sole jurisdiction over employer-sponsored health care, has a rightful seat at the negotiating table as Congress works toward a solution to protect families from crippling surprise medical bills. The Ban Surprise Billing Act includes a benchmark payment for claims under $750 and an independent dispute resolution process for claims above $750. This represents a major concession reflecting the concerns expressed by providers. Previous legislation had no arbitration or a $1,250 threshold. The bill also includes additional transparency provisions to provide more clarity about costs for patients. This bill is very similar to the December 2019 agreement between Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Chairman Alexander, House Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman Frank Pallone, and Ranking Member Walden. The White House has also expressed support for that proposal. We know that President Trump wants Congress to pass a solution, and it is important that we work to deliver a bill that he can sign into law so that patients are protected. This markup is only one step in a process that involves 4 other congressional committees. Future negotiations will be necessary. If the committee can report this bill, members who want to participate in the process of providing our constituents relief from surprise medical bills, including those who may disagree with elements of the committee's approach, will have a stronger voice in the final outcome. And I conclude that and yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Anyone else wish to speak to the bill, to the amendment nature of a substitute? If not, does anyone member wish to offer an amendment? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala. And as you call up your bill, many members have more than one amendment. If you can refer to the legislative services description in the top line on the left of the bill with that number, the clerk will know which amendment to pull.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800. The amendment is number 44.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Ms. Shalala of Florida.
This is a simple amendment. I hope.
Just a minute. Wait until it's.
Mr. Chairman.
Young lady from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I would reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Is this the Ways and Means?
Description of the bill, of the amendment. Okay. Okay. We'll do it after this amendment. Can we do it after this amendment?
After this amendment?
Yeah.
You want to do it after?
Yeah, because we're in the middle, yeah, we're in the middle of an amendment right now.
Okay.
Okay. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this is a very simple amendment. I hope it will be non-controversial. This amendment will allow for patients undergoing care for complex conditions to keep their coverage at in-network cost sharing if their provider changes network status during their treatment. They would be able to keep their coverage and hence their provider for 90 days. This amendment ensures that someone who is undergoing treatment from a trusted doctor, hospital, or other provider, and for some reason that provider is no longer part of the patient's network, that the patient would be able to keep seeing that provider as if they were still in network for 90 days. This means that someone who is pregnant and found out that their OB/GYN or nurse midwife is no longer in network would have 90 days to find a new provider. It means that someone whose parent, spouse, or loved one who is dying and receiving hospice care would not be required to find a new hospice if for some reason an insurance company dropped the hospice provider from their network. It means that someone who is going through chemotherapy would have 90-day grace period to find a new oncologist if their insurance company drops their oncologist. These are the trials that people across our country are facing on a daily basis. This amendment gives a little breathing room for patients and families to find new doctors, hospitals, hospice, or other provider if for some reason their current provider becomes out of network. I urge support of the amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak to the amendment? Dr. Rowe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support this amendment. Personally seen this in my practice where a patient was in the middle of therapy and then would drop from a network. I think this is a common sense amendment. It should be supported by everyone. I yield back.
Anyone else wish to speak to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I support the amendment, and I'd like to withdraw my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. No further comment on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If you could designate your amendment.
It's ELFC Murphy _01.
Mr. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. Murphy of North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. And if we'll delay while the amendment is being distributed. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too hope this is a non-controversial amendment. Within ERISA's jurisdiction, this changes the amount of time that communications and records are retained between insurance companies and providers from 2 years to 5 years at a minimum, as a means to foster more trust, record keeping, and longer working relationships. The committee summary states that the bill, H.R. 5800, includes a number of bipartisan reforms to improve transparency in health coverage, including a requirement that health plans maintain up-to-date and accurate provider directories. I believe my amendment will provide more transparency, foster more trust between parties, strengthen record keeping, and create better and longer working relationships between healthcare providers like myself and insurance companies. The amendment is simple, mirrors successful initiatives in state law models, and extends the amount of time that price negotiation, communications, and proof of plan records between participants and beneficiaries are required to be retained by insurers from 2 years to 5 years. It may seem like a common sense thing, but I will tell you, just if things are lost, then we have to start from ground zero, which provides more confusion and problems for patients. A lot can change in these times, and in the digital age, it's important to increase record-keeping requirements to promote effective data collection and ensure longer working relationships, especially for parties who are often adversarial in negotiations over the course of actually several years. And so I would ask that the committee support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other comments on the amendment? Any other comments on the amendment? Does the gentleman insist on his
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my
point of order is
objection.
withdrawn. There being no further comments on the amendment, all in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments? Gentlelady from Florida. Gentlelady from Florida.
I have an amendment at the desk to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. It's Amendment 45.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, it's very important to us that a patient's choice in provider or access to a provider is not unintentionally limited by our efforts. I've always believed that all providers in our healthcare system should be able to engage in their full scope of practice allowed by their states. Many non-physicians, particularly advanced practice nurses, play a primary role in providing the highest quality care and filling gaps in access to care across our country. This amendment would underline the importance of the provider non-discrimination law that is established in law, which prohibits insurance networks from discriminating against a class of healthcare providers acting within their scope of practice. Let me emphasize again, this amendment does not change state scope of practice laws. These are people working within the state's scope of practice. It simply requires that the 3 agencies to implement existing law from the Affordable Care Act that requires insurance companies not to discriminate against non-physician providers. Our healthcare system will not work efficiently until everyone is working up to their full licensure allowed by their states. This amendment does not impose any willing provider requirements on the health plans. It does not prevent group health plans or health insurance issuers from establishing varying reimbursement rates based on quality or performance measures. Provider non-discrimination provisions signed into law should be properly enforced, requiring insurers to reimburse all providers equally for the same procedures. Inadequate networks stifle access and increase costs. We have to work to ensure that we are promoting competition and consumer choice and avoiding anything that might restrict access to necessary care. This amendment is supported by a large number of healthcare groups. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, the others want to comment on the amendment? Anyone else wish to comment on the amendment? If not, gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my reservation.
Reservation is withdrawn. No further comment on the amendment. Question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Florida will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Before we proceed to the next amendment, I want to clarify for my colleague, Mr. Sablon, and others, that H.R. 5800 does apply to territories. This is because the bill relies on a definition of, quote, state that applies to the territories. Therefore, the protections against surprise billing under this bill will be afforded equally to patients and families in those areas. Is there does someone else have an amendment? Wait a minute. Gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer amendment EL-FC Murphy _02.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. Murphy of North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman.
Just a minute.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from California reserves a point of order. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully, again, another non-controversial amendment. Essentially provides an independent resolution process reporting requirement to publicly list the average time it takes for insurers to respond to providers after the first sign of billing disputes or negotiations, and also a comparison of the average time it takes for a dispute to be resolved between parties before an enactment of this bill. Essentially, we'd just like to see how this bill affects negotiations between the two different parties. Because of the committee's jurisdiction relevant to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, I'm offering an amendment to add additional independent dispute resolution reporting requirements regarding information related to the average response time and rate of settlements of billing disputes for the Department of Labor to make those available to the public. Specifically, this amendment adds one reporting requirement to list the average amount of time it takes insurers to respond to providers after first contact has been made in a billing dispute. As a provider myself, I think it sheds a light on how slow the disputes take and how oftentimes things are backpedaled really to the disadvantage of providers, and will help to improve the overall completion rate of billing negotiation. The amendment also adds a second reporting requirement to publicly list information comparing the average period for resolving such a billing discrepancy among applicable providers, facilities, plans, or insurers, as well as the average period taken to resolve such a discrepancy or billing dispute. I believe the amendment will help track metrics of dispute remediation, and Congress will be able to see better if the passage of this bill has improved the ability to settle disputes in a more timely manner. I ask for committee support of the bill, and I yield back.
Did he say committee support of the bill or the amendment?
I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman. The amendment, please.
I thought you changed your mind.
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
I'm listening.
I withdraw my reservation.
Gentleman withdraws his reservation. Others wish to speak to the amendment? If not, all in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed, say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Next, someone else have an amendment? Gentlelady?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Ms. Omar of Minnesota.
Just a minute.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Order is reserved, and the gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would add to the underlying legislators' surprise billing prevention measures, protecting consumers from additional stress that they certainly don't need when facing medical procedures. H.R. 5800 requires that patients receive notification 72 hours in advance if the non-emergency care they're planning to receive is out of network and such subject to higher cost. I'm glad to see the inclusion of such provision, but as we know, that kind of guidance can often be more confusing than clarifying. I'm sure every person in this room has had one time or another received a letter from their insurance company that left them thinking, And these formally worded documents can be even more confusing when patients' first language isn't English. English is my second language, and I can assure you the terms out-of-pocket, premium, deductible aren't usually commonly heard in a language course. That's why my amendment would require the secretary to create a template for a 24-hour notification that is worded in an easily understandable manner and ensures that it is easily made available in multiple languages. Facing medical procedures is complicated enough for too many of us. We should be allowing patients to focus on their care and recovery rather than forcing them to translate and comprehend overly bureaucratic documents. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Anyone wish to speak against the amendment? If not, gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my reservation.
Reservation is withdrawn. No further comment on the amendment. Question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the amendment nature of a substitute at the desk, number 45.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is simple. It would strike all provisions reforming air ambulance payments from the bill in front of us today. I think it's certainly reasonable that we look at and consider the cost of air ambulance rides, but we need to do this in a thoughtful way. Rushing a reform of this magnitude without considering the impact on patient care could have life-altering consequences. For instance, I'm concerned that the data relied upon by those supporting air ambulance reforms is flawed, since a GAO study used as the basis for the calls for reform only used data from 20,276 out of 550,000 air ambulance transports in 2017. On top of that, a benchmark for these services could disincentivize insurers and providers entering into contracts, leading to more out-of-network trips or worse, a loss of access to air ambulance services in regions like my home of East Tennessee that need them the most. The number of air ambulance bases across the country is already decreasing, with 40 base closures last year. It's reasonable to consider legislation that looks into the air ambulance utilization habits across the country, but simply enacting legislation that caps reimbursement for these services without possessing all relevant data is short-sighted and could do nothing more than reduce access to care for patients at the most critical time that they need care. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, strip this unnecessary provision from the bill, and take some more time to carefully consider how best to make reforms to this sector in a way that improves patient care. We should be focusing here on the important components of surprise billing, taking the patient out of the middle, and a fair and balanced approach to payment disputes, not government price fixing. I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to speak to the amendment? And I'd move to strike the last word to speak in opposition to the amendment. Unexpected medical bills, including surprise medical bills, lead the list of expenses most Americans worry about to at least be able to afford. 2/3 of Americans say they're either very worried or somewhat worried about being able to afford their own family members' unexpected medical bills. That's why it's so important that we're here today to continue the conversation and move this legislation forward. The bill contains vital consumer protections, including those who rely on an air ambulance. Air ambulances play a vital role in responding to medical emergencies, particularly in rural areas. However, the high price often leaves unsuspecting consumers left holding the bag, often to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. One air ambulance sought to recover $50,000 from a woman in Bismarck, North Dakota, for transport that would have taken less than an hour by ground. She was left owing over $40,000 on the bill. The GAO has reported that the cost for air ambulances is skyrocketing. Median price for air ambulance services doubled in just 4 years, from 2010 to 2014. Americans across the country cannot wait any longer, and Congress must act to protect them from unexpected and exorbitant costs, and that includes doing something about the cost of air ambulances. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and yield back the balance of my time. Does anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? Gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands.
Yes, if I may, strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And if I may also have a colloquy, I have a question or two with the chairman, if that's allowed.
Okay.
Okay, the present language and the amendment in the nature of a substitute provides a procedure, a process in where disputes over billings over ambulance services, that there is a set amount where there's no dispute. It should be, or the price would be pursuant to the median service, cost of services in that geographical area for that particular service. Or in the alternative for air ambulance, it would be any amount over $7,500 would be open to an IDR. Is that correct?
It's over 20, for air ambulances, it's over $25,000.
Okay, thank you. See, where I come from, again, in my experience with my late brother-in-law, he was going to take a 3.5-hour flight from Saipan, my home, to Manila. And we're lucky that the air ambulance actually had a patient that would be brought back to Guam. So we paid for like half the cost of the air ambulance, and the cost was $80-some thousand one way. And that was a large bill that we had no choice. We had to help my sister out. His family helped out, so it was eventually resolved. But at the present time, there is that sole air company that was providing air ambulance out of Guam is no longer doing business out of Guam. They have moved to Hawaii and California. So this is my concern on air ambulance. But at least for me, at least there is a process right now. I would think that the amendment offered by Dr. Rowe removes this process that sets a benchmark. So I would support the, I would unfortunately oppose the amendment.
Does anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? Gentleman from California?
I withdraw my reservation.
Reservation is withdrawn. Anyone else to wish to speak to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed, no. No.
Ask for recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and they'll be, as previously indicated, rolled with the others. Amendments, gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Schreier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk. Legislative Council 1.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Ms. Schreier.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I discussed this bill earlier, I expressed concern about what would happen with network adequacy, that if we have benchmarking, that will drive down the reimbursement rates to physicians. It disincentivizes insurance companies to contract with the half of the doctors or hospitals to whom they pay more than the median, and may result, especially in rural communities who are already affected by small networks may disproportionately affect them. In fact, I've heard from rural hospitals in my district, one in Leavenworth, saying the outcome of this bill would be very destructive. They already have very limited networks. This could make things worse. I've heard it from my hospital in Kittitas County as well. And so what this does is it merely commissions a study to see what happens with network adequacy. And then if we see what I fear might be the outcome of inadequate networks and more of a burden on patients, then we could address it. This simply commissions a study. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? If not, gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my reservation.
Reservation is withdrawn. If no further comments for the amendment, all in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments, Dr. Rowe?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to amendment nature of a substitute, number 47.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. Rowe, David P. Rowe of Tennessee.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would ensure providers receive at least some compensation after an incident of care. Does not have to wait until the IDR process is complete to receive payment. Under this amendment, an insurer would be required to provide a commercially reasonable payment to the provider who rendered services, even if that provider decides to go into arbitration with the insurer. It's important to note that this is substantially similar to the successful model in New York State crafted by my good friend from across the aisle, Mr. Morelli, and allows for providers to receive some payment not dictated by the government for their services. Allowing the market to decide across the country what commercially reasonable means is the most fair market method of approaching this issue, particularly when it comes to an interim payment. I know from experience that when insurers can withhold fair payment for services, it can be lengthy for providers to be compensated, and that has real-world consequences to how they organize their practices. As an independent physician, you could be out on the street if you don't receive compensation in a timely fashion and restrict care. It could be median in-network, it could be previously contracted rates, it could be prior charges, or even some other amount. As Mr. Courtney brought up, it's not the government's job to tell insurers and providers what fair compensation for services are rendered. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment because if providers aren't getting paid, they won't be around very long to provide services. I yield back.
To the amendment.
I withdraw my point of order.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Yes, I simply support this amendment. It makes sense, and it's particularly important for providers in rural areas, people that just can't handle the cash flow. So I support the amendment.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Just briefly, I'd like to reinforce that as well, particularly in rural areas or areas that are very much out of the way. I think that this makes sense, and I do support the amendment as well.
Anyone else, excuse me, anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? Excuse me. If not, I recognize myself to speak against the amendment. You know, we have to remind ourselves what we're here for. These are surprise bills, not just because they're technically out of network. It's the shocking size of the bill that is a surprise. If we knew what commercially reasonable was, we could deal with it, but the bill provides benchmark of in-network median. That is a price that's been negotiated. It didn't fall out of the sky. It's negotiated between the providers and the insurance company as a reasonable fee. Now, it's interesting to note that if we want a bill passed, if we want to do something for consumers, this is the last direction we want to go in. I'd note that we don't have any support on this legislation from insurance companies because it includes too much arbitration. We do have support from consumer groups, Families USA, Community Catalyst, and others, from patient groups, American Heart Association, National Alliance for Mentally Ill, and others, labor groups. Most letters that we have condition their support on no amendments to the bill that would increase arbitration or uncertainty. If you want to know what chance more uncertainty has, you can just look at the Senate, 20-3 in the Health Committee on a bill with no arbitration at all, benchmarks all the way through. When you offer a phrase like commercially reasonable, you got to negotiate each and every time. It injects uncertainty, better known as increasing costs, and I would hope that we would defeat this amendment. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
I ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
Recorded vote is requested, and that will be rolled. Next amendment. Does the gentlelady from Nevada have an amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. I have an
Mr.
amendment
Chairman.
at this.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mrs. Lee of Nevada.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved in the The gentlelady from Nevada is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like many states, we have a serious doctor shortage in Nevada. A 2018 study found that we rank 48th per capita in primary care physicians and 49th in surgeons in the country. Current doctors are nearing retirement, and not enough are moving in to replace them. And Nevada is projected to have the fewest physicians per capita in 2022, most especially in our rural areas. And that's why I'm introducing this amendment, which requires the GAO to study this bill's impact on Americans' access to health care providers, especially in areas with doctor shortages like Nevada and in rural and underserved communities. While there's no doubt that we must act now to save Nevadans and all Americans from surprise medical billing, it is also critical that we support our local doctors so they can continue to serve and provide critical care in our local communities. No matter what, we can all agree that our ultimate goal here is to expand access to quality and affordable health care for every American, and that's what we're here to do today. As this bill moves forward, I look forward to working with my colleagues towards a final package that protects patients from exorbitant medical costs and surprise medical bills, while also ensuring that our local doctors and medical professionals can continue to serve our local and underserved communities. Thank you, and I urge my colleagues in joining me in support of this amendment.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Other comments on the amendment? Gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question, if I could ask of the sponsor of the amendment, the gentle lady from Nevada. On the effect of on line 6, that clause there, the review includes, the review of rural and underserved communities and health professional shortage areas. Obviously, in this committee, we call the outlying areas, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, my home in the Northern Marianas. In her intention with this amendment, are the territories included?
To the extent that they are underserved, I would imagine they'd be included.
So if you're saying it's a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Yes, back. Are there other comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my reservation.
Reservation is withdrawn. There being no further comments on the amendment, questions on the amendment, all in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Does the gentleman from Tennessee have
Thank
another
you, Mr.
amendment?
Chair. I have an amendment to the amendment nature of a substitute number 48.
The Mr. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. David P. Rowe of Tennessee.
Gentleman.
Reserve a point of order.
California reserves a point of order. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The bill in front of us today relies upon government rate setting and forces healthcare providers to accept a median in-network rate paid by insurers to other providers, regardless of previously contracted rates between the two parties, or any other factors that may go into determining a fair reimbursement rate. Severity of the case, difficulty, training, many things that can go into that. My amendment would strike all references to median contracted rate in the bill and would instead replace them with a more fair and reasonable prior contracted rate, since that actually encompasses the rates previously accepted by the provider and previously paid by the insurer. We should be promoting robust, expanded insurance networks instead of incentivizing insurers not to negotiate in good faith with providers, because they know in the end that if the provider refuses to accept a lowball offer, they most likely will be required to pay the median in-network rate regardless of whether the provider had previously been in network. This amendment is common sense and does nothing more than maintain the right to privately contract. I urge its passage because government price fixing never works, and forcing providers to accept arbitrarily low reimbursements will only force them out of practice, reduce quality and access to care. That I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from Washington, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say this seems very reasonable to me. This is a way to prevent some of the slide that we were talking about, where median in-network rate may slowly over time go down and down and down as networks shrink and insurance companies have more control. This is a way of saying, hey, this is a rate that the insurance companies have agreed upon in the past, the doctors have agreed upon in the past, that's reasonable, and so I would support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I would agree with both my colleagues who have, I think, articulated this well. If you have a situation in which there was a previously contracted amount for these services, I can't imagine why, and that was negotiated between that party directly and the insurer. I don't know why we would move to have some rate setting outside of that negotiation. I think that's fundamental to what we seek to do, and I think this is entirely reasonable, as my colleague from Washington said, and I appreciate the gentleman offering the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized. 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Today's in-network rates are significantly higher because balanced billing is allowed. In other words, providers, particularly staffing firms owned by private equity, can use the threat of going out of network to arbitrarily drive up reimbursements. In fact, emergency medicine average payments are 5.4 times higher than Medicare payment rates, according to one study. The same is true for specialties that patients don't select, like anesthesiologists, whose average rates are 6.4 times higher than Medicare payments. This is the direct negative result of using the threat of going out of network. If Congress were to use most recently contracted rate, lawmakers, both Democrat and Republican, would be rewarding private equity, the very bad actors who have manipulated this market failure by baking their higher payments into law for perpetuity. I'm reluctantly opposed to this amendment.
Thank you. The others wish to speak to the amendment. If gentleman from New Jersey, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to briefly say, I think this is a smart way of ensuring that we don't have, as the previous members mentioned, a slide, that we ensure that we maintain our doctors, that we maintain a system that is fair and yet helps the patients, and yet doesn't hurt our hospitals, doesn't hurt our physicians, which ultimately hurts our patients. It goes all the way down the line. So I think this is a good and solid alternative that we should take seriously. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. This would replace median in-network rate, which is a discernible number, with the vague commercially reasonable rate, which you would inject uncertainty into the system and therefore extra costs. When insurance companies have uncertainty, they charge more. This median in-network rate is fair and reasonable. It has been negotiated. It has strong support not only from health policy experts, from other committees in both houses of Congress. And if we expect a bill to pass, this is a step in the wrong direction. Yield back. If there are other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Requested a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Does the gentlelady from Washington have an amendment? Ms. Schreier?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk, number 34.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Ms. Schreier of Washington.
The gentlelady from North Carolina?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Point of order has already been reserved. And the gentlelady, point of order is reserved by the gentlelady from North Carolina. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our goal with this bill is to first protect the patient, then make sure that there's fair payment to doctors and hospitals, and that hospitals and insurance companies have a meeting of the mind. I've already spoken to benchmarking and that I am not in favor of that, but that there could be a discussion between the insurance company and the doctor to just strike the right balance and come to an agreement without government interference. Now, if that doesn't work, the last resort is independent dispute resolution, and this is baseball-style arbitration, where each party, the doctor or hospital, and the insurance company brings their best offer to the table, and an arbiter then needs to decide. And so the question is, what information is that arbiter going to use to make that decision? And part of what we've been talking about today is the median in-network rate. Others would be a customary and reasonable rate. But there are other factors that go in. Is this a regular obstetrician or a high-risk obstetrician? Is this a doctor who works in a regular hospital or a university hospital that takes much more complicated patients? How much experience does the doctor have? Do they take more complex cases? And I wanted to add one more thing for that arbiter to consider, which is, has the doctor and has the insurance company come together and really made a good faith effort to be in network? Is that doctor charging so much that they will accept no price offered by the insurance company? Is the insurance company lowballing so much that no reasonable doctor or hospital could accept that payment? And I think that should be taken into consideration by the arbiter. Who's really making a good faith effort? Because what we would like to have is more doctors in network so that we don't even have the surprise billing issues show up. And this is one way to make sure that there is a push to have good faith negotiations between doctors, hospitals, and insurance companies before the fact. So I would encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you. I'd like to support this amendment, will support this amendment, and several things that my colleague said is absolutely right. When you, let's go back and look at this. I've appreciated this discussion we've had today, and let's just make this very simple. One, we all want to remove the patient from the surprise medical billing. We all want to do that. Every bill does that. The question is, how do we get there fairly? And one of the things that the New York model did that I liked was it fairly allowed, it didn't hand the car keys to anybody. It allowed the providers and the insurance companies to negotiate a price. And if they could not, then it went to arbitration. Well, and as we talked about last night, Mr. Chairman, the real question is, what instructions does the arbiter have to come up with a conclusion? Well, I think the Ways and Means bill, and some of our bill here does, it comes, one of the things that the arbiter can consider is the in-network charges, price, cost, what they pay. Previously contracted rates, geography, training, complexity of the case. The arbiter may be asked for more information, like outcomes of this particular physician. What outcomes have you had? What they can't consider are charges. So if you give those instructions, most of the time you're going to discourage arbitration. They're going to come to a solution before that. And as you've seen, I mean, literally millions of claims in New York State filed, and very few actually ever get to arbitration. Why? Because they're encouraged not to do that. That's what we want to do with our legislation, is to make the network larger and reduce the number of people that actually go to IDR. And if you'll let the free market system work, it will work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The other comments on the amendment? Gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. I'll speak in favor of this amendment, but I do note, just broadly speaking, that much of the argument over the last several weeks and months appears to frame this as either a question of rate setting versus an independent dispute resolution. I think that's a false way to frame this. What what we did in New York, and while I'm certainly not suggesting the model in New York be taken entirely and put here as it relates to ERISA, it is important to remember two basic tenets of the New York model, which I think bear repeating here as we work through this. The first is, as my colleagues have so eloquently described, this ought to be a negotiation between the parties. This should not be the heavy hand of government reaching in to determine that some other negotiation, which may not have included the parties in question, is used as the government-sponsored rate. And in my view, it's completely unnecessary. This simply ought to be a negotiation between the two parties that effectively have skin in the game. You've removed the consumer. Now there's a question about what the cost of that service ought to be and who ought to be responsible for it. And so allowing that negotiation to occur is appropriate. That seems to me the framework in the first instance. The second is then the question of whether or not you have independent dispute resolution. That's really, in my mind, a question of due process. If either party feels that the negotiation, which has gone on for a period of weeks, and I think in the case of one of the proposals a month, fails to arrive at a solution they feel is justified or reasonable, they can then access the independent dispute resolution process, which in my mind, I know there's a lot of questions about arbitration. The independent dispute resolution process that is being described here and being discussed in a number of different proposals is what we call baseball-style arbitration or baseball-style dispute resolution, where each of the parties submit what they think is their best offer. And they could submit information which details why they believe that's appropriate. There are a number of ways to give guidance to the independent dispute resolution official to look at the two offers, because they're going to make a decision. They're going to choose one. They're not going to go back and forth between the parties. This is choose one of the two proposals that have been submitted. And it's that direction that you give, it's that guidance you give to the independent dispute resolution agent, which really sort of forms and frames how these decisions will be resolved. It's true in New York, they use 80th percentile of under something called the FAIR Plan. There are other ways of doing it. Certainly, we have suggested, a number of others have suggested using the median in-network rate as one of the data points. But it's really, really important that we allow the parties the time to work this out and then allow a due process function. And that's really the two takeaways in New York. And that's what's happening in Texas as well, where they, I think, rarely will borrow from a New York model, but in this case did. I think they show good judgment in this case, and it has worked exceedingly well. And in New York, despite what you're hearing, we have prior approval of insurance rates. So insurers every year, when they come for an increase in rates, they have to identify what are the factors that are causing them to seek an increase in their insurance rates, their health insurance rates. Not one time in the last 5 years has any single insurer in the state of New York cited surprise billing legislation as the cause of the rationale for increasing premiums. There are a whole host of other things. In every state we're seeing increased premiums, but it is not the surprise billing legislation which has done it. In fact, that has had the net effect of saving consumers hundreds of millions of dollars, $400 million that are not being billed to patients any longer. It's had the effect of putting more providers in network. The exact thing we're talking about, making these networks more robust. We have network adequacy laws in New York as well. And finally, as I say, insurers have not cited it. I think the amendment before the committee is fair, it's reasonable, it's thoughtful, and I will certainly vote to support it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my reservation.
Reservation is withdrawn. No further comments on the amendment. The question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Smucker, you have an amendment. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, has an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point.
Clerk report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. Sparker of Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from California.
I reserve a point of order.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of agreement here on several issues. One is we all agree that patients should be protected from surprise medical bills. I've also heard from a number of other members here today that there's agreement that this would be better left to the parties involved, the insurance companies and the providers. Mr. Morelli just made that point, that negotiation between the parties would work better. I know Secretary Shalala has said the same thing. She believes that these negotiations should occur and not be set at the federal level. The ranking member said that she's not sure that we should be here discussing this issue except for the failure of those negotiations to occur when they need to. I will say this. The private market has, in many cases, stepped up. In the district that I represent and across Pennsylvania, there are many health insurance plans, hospital systems, and providers that have negotiated their own contracts, outlining how they'll manage balance billing, ensuring that patients don't see balance billing at all. And they've made these they've negotiated this with providers. Insurance companies have negotiated with providers who may not be in the network providers. So this amendment does one simple thing, and I don't know where we'll end up in regards to how, whether there is any federal rate setting. I have trouble with that concept of the federal government setting in and establishing rates, but I don't know what we'll do in the end, at the end of the day. But what this amendment ensures is that when there are providers and insurance companies who have entered into those agreements on their own, that those agreements will not be superseded by the federal law. So that's in essence, the only thing this amendment does. It ensures that when there are existing contracts in place which manage balance billing, that they will be permitted to continue to operate under that contract as long as consumers are held harmless within any of those contractual provisions. That, I believe, Mr. Chairman, is the free market approach. We should be encouraging those type of agreements between networks and providers, not disrupting them. Allowing those contracts to continue to operate will incentivize both insurers, hospitals, and providers to help keep health care costs lower for consumers, and ultimately will ensure that those consumers are held harmless. So I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Others wish to speak to the amendment. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to support the amendment by my colleague from Pennsylvania. There are institutions that provide care, and insurance companies do have agreements. They've figured out how to do it properly, and I think this is a good amendment to the bill to make sure that everybody gets the best care they can at an affordable price. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Anyone else wish to speak to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I acknowledge that this issue, as we're speaking, this language is being drafted for this amendment. As I mentioned earlier, it would be hard for me to support the underlying bill without an amendment of this sort, but there are still issues that are being worked on. I'm hoping that as we work through this bill, we can include an amendment of this sort, but at this point, I withdraw my amendment and I yield back.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Smucker for his efforts in this regard and to say that it's a good faith effort, and he's correct. We are working to try to put something like this into the bill, and I appreciate his offering and withdrawing the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'd also point out that we just received the amendment shortly before the markup and have not had time to review it. but we work in good faith to see if we can adopt it later on in the process.
Thank you.
Are there other amendments? Mr. Morelli? Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Is it Amendment 01?
Which amendment are you offering?
This is the, an amendment in the form of a substitution.
Do you have a number? Do you have a number on the upper left-hand corner of the amendment, first page?
I think it says 2 on my draft. Number 1, sorry, number 1.
Thank you. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from New York is recognized on behalf of this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsor of this amendment, Secretary Shalala, Dr. Rowe, Dr. Schreier, and Ms. Lee, and for their cooperation, their help. After what I consider a long delay of action on this issue, I am obviously want to express my disappointment that we're moving forward with a framework that would essentially enable health insurers to exert even more authority in the healthcare system. At its heart, this is a private dispute between two co-equal entities once we take consumers out of the mix. And I think we all agree here, no matter which proposal, that consumers need to be taken out of the surprise billing and made whole. And then it is, at its heart, this dispute between two parties, health plans and providers. And those providers come in many forms. They're hospitals, whether it's rural hospitals, children's hospitals, academic medical centers, as well as all the various specialties and subspecialties. And I note that there is a significant disparity between those different categories. All hospitals are not alike. All physicians are not alike. All specialists are not alike. The bill before us now relies on a rate-setting framework that would enable health insurers to exert even more authority in the healthcare system. My biggest problem with this, and the reason we took the approach we did in New York, is because we believe this ought to be the subject of a negotiation between those private entities, and let them work out once the consumer has been removed from it, and allow those negotiations to resume. This effectively tips the scale towards one party. And you could look at it as though it's somehow the result of a negotiation, but many times the provider who's submitting the surprise bill heretofore hasn't been a part of that negotiation at all. And so this allows health plans to continue to move downward pressure on reimbursement rates, which will have disparate, untold impacts on networks all across this country, and certainly on many institutions. And I note rural hospitals and others have raised real concerns about that. And frankly, there's no public policy rationale for this approach. Why you wouldn't let a negotiation and have a due process makes no sense to me. This isn't even government rate setting. It's allowing a health plan to set the rate they will pay to out-of-network providers. These rates may have been negotiated in good faith with one doctor. It would then require another doctor or another hospital who didn't participate in that negotiation to accept that payment rate. And that seems to me is incredibly unfair. Moreover, there is little in the bill that would prevent profit-seeking health insurance companies from dropping doctors from their networks who had negotiated rates above the median, which is half of all doctors in the plan. If a provider and plan previously agreed to $2,000 reimbursement for a service, but the plan's median in-network rate is $1,000, it makes business sense for the plan to simply kick the doctor out of the network and pay the lower cost. They can do that over and over, and even try to lower the median in-network rates over time by rejecting any providers that make, quote-unquote, too much, despite the fact that there may be many reasons for the higher rate. Who loses? Patients can no longer access quality medical care in their health networks. This will have an impact on health networks all across the United States, and it will certainly impact rural hospitals, children's hospitals, academic medical centers. The way to resolve these is through direct negotiation, as set forward in the Ways and Means proposal, the Consumer Protections Against Surprise Medical Bills Act of 2020. The legislation, which I'm proud to co-sponsor, is the most balanced proposal put forward thus far by any House committee. The amendment that I'm offered presents that bill in full. Direct negotiation, provider and insurers have a period of 30 days to make offers and counteroffers to settle on a reasonable sum acceptable to both the health care plans and the health care providers. In New York, that's what makes this system work. The vast majority of cases never, and when I say vast, I mean overwhelmingly vast majority of cases never go to independent dispute resolution because the parties are able to come to terms in a balanced, simple, and thoughtful way. And the system encourages both parties to come in network. That's been the result of the New York model, has been more doctors, more providers in network. That avoids the need for balanced billing of any kind, whether it's surprise or otherwise. And I urge the adoption of my amendment to take us from a rate-setting model determined here in Washington by parties who aren't even a part of that negotiation to a direct negotiation model that is balanced. Although that approach has not been scored by the Congressional Budget Office, our understanding informally in discussions with them is this could save as much as $15 billion over 10 years in savings, and hopefully the CBO scoring will bear that out. So, and Mr. Chairman, if I might, I'd like to ask unanimous consent. I have a series of documents I'd like to have part of the record, including the report by the New York State Department of Financial Services report on the independent dispute resolution process, and as well as letters from the American Hospital Association, a letter which has a series of providers on it, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons and the Plastic Surgery Foundation, Greater New York Hospital Association letter, College of American Pathologists, as well as the Health Association of New York State, if I might ask unanimous consent.
Without objection. Gentleman yields back. Are there other comments?
Yes, thank you.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would replace H.R. 5800 with the Ways and Means surprise billing proposal that will be marked up tomorrow. H.R. 5800 represents a good faith compromise to address contrasting stakeholder viewpoints on how to address surprise billing. The $750 threshold for independent dispute resolution, IDR, and additional considerations for the arbiter represent significant concessions to stakeholders who have raised concerns about previous legislative proposals. H.R. 2800 also includes additional cost transparency provisions, such as improved provider directory requirements, ensuring that patients can receive good faith cost estimates for services, and requiring out-of-pocket costs and deductibles to be included on insurance cards, which will empower patients to make better decisions about their health care. The Ways and Means bill includes only an arbitration framework and leaves much of the IDR process to be determined by government bureaucrats. Considering this committee's jurisdiction over employer-sponsored health care, I do not believe that the Ways and Means legislation is the strongest compromise we can achieve as a committee, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back.
Lady yields back. Other comments on the amendment? Excuse me, gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to strike the last word. One of the
Ladies recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. One of the most important issues that comes up time and time again when I talk to my constituents is on the high cost of health care. With the Federal Reserve's Household Economic Well-Being Report showing that 4 in 10 Americans would not be able to afford a $400 emergency expense. The writing is on the wall. Getting hit with an unexpected medical bill, sometimes reaching into the tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, is a financial blow for too many American families, a blow that they cannot afford to bear the burden of. Many of these balance bills occur where the patient has little or no control over whether or not they're in and out of network. 7 in 10 patients who receive unaffordable out-of-network medical bills were simply unaware that their provider was out of network. Even patients who are diligent self-advocates will end up out of network in a number of situations, including because the network directories are also just out of date. I joined some of my colleagues on this committee to introduce legislation called the Update Act to correct this problem. And I'm pleased that HR 5800 includes provider directory improvements similar to those outlined in this bill, including protections for those in employer-sponsored coverage. The problem is simply unfair, and it's just got to end, which is part of what we're doing here today. It is also great to see this committee come together to address this issue in the way that we have. We all agree that the patient must be taken out of the equation, but the question is how. And while there's no silver fish hook to exclusively solve the problem, our primary goals must be, 1, first and foremost, keeping costs down for the patient, 2, keeping as many providers in network as possible, and 3, ensuring reimbursement rates are reflective of providing care in any given geographic area. It is my hope that reconciliation of these pieces of legislation that have come out of this committee and the other committees of jurisdiction properly meet the goals and addresses the concerns arising from a one-size-fits-all approach. I am looking forward to supporting today's step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other comments on gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Roth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the Coalition Against Rate Setting for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I believe that the Ways and Means bill more closely gets to where we need to be than our bill does, with the exception of if some amendments are made to this bill, and certainly we're not through with the amendment process, it could be something I could support. The ranking member mentioned about benchmarking, about negotiations. Well, a bad idea to negotiate it to a little bit less of a bad idea is not a good idea. And so I would oppose that. And I think we all in this room and everybody in the U.S. Congress, 535 of us, all want to end surprise medical billing. Absolutely believe that. The question is just how do we get there? And we really are very close. The consumer protections, certainly the transparency. Who could argue with saying when you go into the hospital, it's the only place in the world that you go, if you go in to buy a suit or you go in to buy a car, you know what it's going to cost. You go into a hospital, you have no clue what it's going to cost or if it's going to get paid for when you have insurance. So those things are a great idea. I think certainly for people who are paying cash, many people, as I do, have a health savings account, and they may pay cash for a lot of things. They need transparency there. The bills, both Ways and Means, and I think this bill does that. So those things we can all agree about. The question is, it always gets down to what Jerry Maguire said, show me the money. How are we going to pay people? Well, I think basically what we want to do is be fair to each people, to each party, the provider and the insurance company. Don't hand the car keys to anybody. Let them negotiate it out. When they cannot, there's a process that works. And we mentioned last night, we spent a lot of time talking about it, is about what instructions do you give the arbiter. And by the way, the loser pays. So if I'm going to take a bill there, I'm going to have documented pretty well if I think it's going to be worth my time to go do that. So the arbiter can consider in-network, reasonable and customary, whatever they want to as far as charges are concerned. And the experience of the physician, the complexity of the case, previously contracted rates, geography, where you're living, the training. In other words, you've got a very experienced surgeon versus someone else. What they cannot consider are charges. So we agreed on that last night. I think if you would include those things, Mr. Chairman, in this bill, we could get it passed, which is closer to the Ways and Means bill. I want to thank my colleagues. People say we don't work in a bipartisan way up here. That's absolutely not right. I have met with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I want to give them a shout out. We're all trying to get to yes. We just want to be sure, as Mr. Morelli pointed out, that we're not back here 3 years. And I honestly don't think that whatever we pass in the first couple of years is going to make much difference. It takes that long for these contracts to get negotiated anyway, so it's not going to be immediate. But over time, I don't want us up here fixing, oops, we've got narrower networks, less people, and rural hospitals going out of business. I've lost 12 rural hospitals in the state of Tennessee, 12. And you lose a rural hospital where you are in your county, the city where it is in real trouble. And that's my fear where I live. I've been in rural Washington state. I visited there, rural Oregon. I've been there, really literally all over the country visiting with my VA duties. And I would strongly encourage us, we are so close, and we're really very, very close, just about a couple of points. We get to it, I think you could get a very strong vote out of here. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The other comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you and the ranking member, and thank my distinguished colleague, Dr. Rowe, from whom I've learned a lot in this process. Mr. Chairman, all of us agree that we protect the patient. The question is, should we interfere in a private negotiation between two private parties as they figure out how they're going to pick up the bill and therefore protect the patient? And I just don't think the government should interfere in that process. I think that we should force a process in which they have to negotiate, and if they can't agree, then they go to an arbitration process, which is high risk for them because the loser pays, and because they don't go back and forth. As baseball has been explained, each party produces a number, and the arbitrator picks one of those numbers, and the loser pays. And the arbitrator has guidance, some of which we discussed last night. The point of this is that we have never been very good at rate setting in government. And in my long experience, I've learned the difference between a heavy hand and avoiding interfering in private parties negotiating. What government needs to do is to protect the patient. That's what all of these bills do. The question is, who's going to pay and how much interference we're going to put into the process. And many of us prefer the government not intervene in the process of negotiation, but do set up a process that insists that that negotiation is timely and that, of course, it protects the patient. I prefer the Ways and Means bill. With my colleagues, I'm a co-sponsor. This bill, we could have worked out a compromise in this bill, and unfortunately, we didn't have the time to do that. This is essentially the Energy and Commerce bill. So we're comparing one committee's bill to another committee's bill. And I just urge my colleagues to use a light hand of government in this area while making certain that the patient is protected. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The other comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. I also support this amendment because it does substitute what I believe is a better bill. I've been thrilled to work with Dr. Rowe, Ms. Shalala, Mr. Morelli on this. And again, taking price setting out and taking a threshold out just makes for a purer process where we protect the patient. That is all of our goals, and that is true to every one of these bills. And the question is, are we putting a thumb on the scale or not? And the way that the Ways and Means bill is written takes the thumb off the scale. It lets insurance companies and doctors figure it out, still protects the patient, and doesn't risk influencing network size or influencing rates. And I just have a couple quotes from rural hospitals in my district. from Cascadia and Leavenworth. They say our rural insurance networks are already suboptimal, and I'm concerned that anything other direct negotiation and arbitration will further erode the networks that currently exist. They go on to say that the use of benchmarking or median in-network reimbursement will disincentivize health plans to develop and sustain the kind of broad networks we need to serve the people in our community. So I would agree with my colleagues here and other doctors on the committee that letting insurance companies and doctors work this out and making sure we protect the patient is the best way forward. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I would just like to agree with the previous speakers. I think what's so important here, and I know, number one, we're saying the same thing over and over again, we all care about the patients, but we want to make sure that we put in place a model that will hopefully, in perpetuity, be able to go forward without making the choices for patients actually less and less, smaller and smaller, and quite frankly, giving the insurance companies, in some sense, more and more control. I mean, the most important aspect always is the doctor-patient relationship, and we have to do everything that we can do to preserve that. And I think this is a great attempt, and you know, I thank the chairman and the leader for the work that they've done, but I prefer and would support this bill. I think this bill is the answer. I think we have proof that it works. It has worked in New York. I looked up the numbers myself. And again, as I've said, as a dentist, thank God I only have one minor issue with the bill, but I have many, many friends who are physicians of all types who are the good guys, who are the guys that aren't surprise billing people, and they are very concerned and very worried about the track that we're going down right at this moment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The other comments on the amendment? If not, the gentlelady from North Carolina, you insist on your point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I insist on my point of order. Mr. Chairman, Rule 10 of the Rules of the House of Representatives provides that this committee holds jurisdiction over all bills, resolutions, and other matters related to education or labor generally, including employer-provided health plans. However, this committee does not have jurisdiction over multiple provisions this amendment seeks to amend, including but not limited to those amending the Internal Revenue Code, which are outside the committee's jurisdiction. It is important that this committee maintain its precedent of respecting the rules of germaneness in committee jurisdiction. Those rules are well established and should be enforced consistently. Therefore, this amendment should be ruled out of order as several of its provisions do not fall within the committee's jurisdiction under Rule 10.
Does the gentleman from New York wish to speak to the point of order?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I think this has been a very fruitful discussion. I am really grateful for the time and energy that my colleagues on both sides of the issue have given to this, and the eloquence with which they've spoken about the need to protect surprise billing. And I know there's going to be more discussion. There's more committees that have to work on this before it gets to the floor. So with that, I withdraw my amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there other amendments? I think the gentleman from New York has an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. I believe it's numbered number 2.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5800, offered by Mr. Morelli of New York.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the authors of the bill before us today, I believe that independent dispute resolution should be a rarely used appeals process, but available only when truly necessary to reach an agreement between insurers and healthcare providers, doctors, hospitals, et cetera, on a reasonable payment. However, with such a system that's being described like rate setting and benchmarking, an appeals process is more necessary than under a direct negotiation system. This is simply due process. As such, I have serious concerns that the $750 threshold will make this process inaccessible for many hospitals and providers. My amendment would simply strike the provision and allow any provider or plan to access independent dispute resolution process should the health plan's median in-network payment be unacceptable for these services provided. For those of you who have heard from constituents slapped with a $10,000 surprise bill, a $750 threshold may seem like it would simply weed out the minor cases that would clutter up the system. But that is not the case. That's because the threshold is not based on the total bill, but rather each individual item, line item on the bill. It's also based not on the balance of the bill, but what the plan's median in-network rate is for each medical code and for each line item. Thus, you could have a $10,000 or even a $30,000 surprise bill that could not go to independent dispute resolution because no single medical code rises to the level of the threshold as determined by the in-network median rate for that code. This would happen all the time under this legislation that we're considering here today and is effectively a bar for most independent dispute resolution folks who want to access independent dispute resolution. For emergency physicians, one of the specialties most likely to provide unplanned medical services, a reported 95% of care would be locked out of the IDR process entirely under the construct envisioned in this bill. Under this system, some providers, including small physician groups, would be prohibited from accessing an equitable appeals process. This places the power firmly in the hands of the health plans to dictate payments and control future negotiations, squeezing out small providers and harming access for patients. A party seeking to utilize the IDR process knows at the outset that losing would result in paying the costs of IDR, as my colleagues and friends have already identified. This is a loser-pays system that we're suggesting. That alone limits frivolous claims dramatically. No one is going to go to independent dispute resolution over a $250 bill when they pay should they lose. This threshold harms healthcare providers, particularly small practices, through an inaccessible appeals process. I think that adds insult to injury on this system. There's no rationale for it. We should not bar essentially the courthouse door to people, so my amendment would eliminate the threshold altogether, and I think this dramatically improves the bill before us. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other comments on the amendment? On your side. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would drop the independent dispute resolution, or IDR, threshold from $750 to $0. Putting an arbitrary dollar threshold on the statute, no matter how high, makes it unusable for an entire section of the country and entire specialties of medical providers. And as my colleague and friend, Mr. Morelli, said, you're not going to take a $250 claim to an IDR process when if you lose, you pay $400. Even I can figure that math out. The average charge or reimbursement for an emergency room physician is about $120 to $150. If we arbitrarily put a $750 minimum threshold into this legislation, you are effectively telling all emergency room physicians in the country, or most, 95%, that their work doesn't matter, that they should just take whatever they can get, by whatever means they are, whether they're losing money or not. And for instance, you have no control of what your malpractice premiums are. I watch mine go, my medical practice, from $4,000 a year to over $70,000 a year. You have no control of that and many other costs of practice. While I do not support the approach we're taking today, I will do what I can within the limits of this committee's jurisdiction to help address some of the biggest shortcomings in an effort to make a better, while still imperfect, final product. If we want to have an IDR system in place, why would you limit who can use it? This system should be available to every provider, not just those performing high-dollar procedures. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment because while it may not fix all the problems with the bill, it will fix one of the biggest problems with the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you. I want to join my colleagues in supporting this amendment. This bill basically is rate setting followed by an inaccessible arbitration process. And there's no use having an arbitration process if no one can really use it. My colleague has already described the problem that ER doctors would have accessing arbitration, because the threshold is for each individual medical billing code. In addition, the threshold is based not on what the doctor or hospital is billed, but what the plan usually pays for that code. So again, the power is in the hands of the insurance company. If we're going to have an appeals process, if we're going to have an arbitration process, it has to be available to everyone. And therefore, I strongly support this amendment. Without a meaningful and accessible appeals process, the issues with rate setting will be made worse, shifting the balance of power firmly to the health plans. I yield back.
Yields back. Others wish, Dr. Murphy, gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just rise in support of this amendment. I'm not going to belabor the details. We've talked about them before. Again, this is rate setting by the government, and for the issues that and the details that have been spoken about previously, all that providers are asking for is fairness. Just at the table, having a fair ability to negotiate. Setting a rate, a specific rate, allows manipulation by insurance companies to get around what are fair negotiations. And so I would ask my colleagues on a bipartisan level to support this amendment. We want, as I've said previously, we don't want one particular party to have the keys to the kingdom. We've had models now in this country that have shown that this has worked and that rate setting is not the right thing to do. We talk about access, we talk about problems also with rural access to hospitals, and I fear if we go down this road of rate setting, not only is it against what we believe negotiations should occur, it will have disastrous effects upon our rural areas and those most in need. Thank you, and I support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate all of my colleagues on this debate and note again how we're working in such a bipartisan fashion with different groups on both sides of this issue. In October, the No Surprises campaign, a coalition that includes organizations like Family USA Action, AFSCME, National Partnership for Women and Families, and Public Citizen, put out a comparison of CBO projected savings from different bills on this topic, and here it is. The Senate Help Committee's original bill, which solved surprise billing entirely through a benchmark approach, saved $25 billion over 10 years, around $3 billion more than any approach that included arbitration. Given that we're in a new year now and the outlook would go another year into the future, it's my understanding that those savings would be even more robust. But the lower the arbitration threshold gets, the less the legislation saves. I'm concerned about leaving money on the table, money that could be reinvested in things we all care about, like research at the NIH. I'm also troubled by what the data show about how arbitration might impact patients. In October, Brookings put out an analysis of data from the New York Department of Financial Services. They found, quote, "These data suggest that the state's arbitration process is substantially increasing what New Yorkers pay for health care," end quote. NPR subsequently reported, quote, "The New York model is making health care substantially more expensive in the state," end quote. Now, I understand the New York example and the item before us don't allow for precise apples-to-apples comparisons, but I think the findings merit our attention nonetheless. This is a complex issue that we all want to get right. I think the best way we can ensure we do that is to learn from the data we have and craft a policy that reflects lessons learned from the states. I think the data show that an arbitration approach isn't the best one for patients. I think you and the ranking member have found the correct balance, and so I oppose this amendment and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back with other comments on the amendment. Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to again say that I have great respect for my colleagues and this discussion that's been happening. However, I do rise in opposition to this amendment, and I just wanted to add to my colleague from Michigan's comments about this and remind the committee again about the process that we have already gone through. The Senate Help Committee, which is a Republican-controlled committee, my U.S. Senator is the ranking member, Senator Patty Murray, passed a bipartisan bill with 20-3, I believe was the original vote, with no arbitration whatsoever. The House Energy and Commerce Committee then passed a bill which included some compromise. It had a hybrid arbitration and benchmarking model that would allow surprise bills to go to arbitration if they were above $1,250. The compromise in this committee has lowered that threshold again to $750, similar to the deal that was announced late last year between the Senate Help Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. It is, as I said in my earlier remarks, already very difficult for some of us to accept this because at the end of the day, we want the biggest savings for patients. We want to make sure that we are taking on this issue of surprise billing in a substantial way. And at the end of the day, it's patients' lives and financial security that are at stake. So this amendment, which zeroes out that arbitration threshold, is not a compromise. It is the polar opposite of where we started, with an ask from labor, business, and consumer groups to have a benchmark model of 125% of Medicare rates with no arbitration. And that is why this erosion of this compromise is opposed by leading patient advocates, including the AFL-CIO, AFSCME, Families USA, and many other groups. At the end of the day, I do believe that we are trying to get to the best answer for the crisis of surprise billing that is affecting our constituents everywhere, rural, urban, red, blue, purple, everywhere across this country. We need to address this crushing weight of medical expenses. It is just not right that 4 in 10 people with employer coverage have difficulty affording healthcare costs, or that 30% of people say that healthcare costs are restricting their ability to meet basic needs like obtaining food or heating or housing, or that every year 500,000 Americans declare bankruptcy in part due to medically related costs or illnesses. So we can't afford further erosions of a bill that passed with tremendous bipartisan consensus in a Republican-controlled Senate and further erode the ability to provide relief to the suffering of Americans across this country. So I hope we oppose this amendment, and I hope we stop continuing to erode the compromise that came out of the Senate Help Committee. Thank you. I yield back.
Are there others who wish to speak to the amendment? Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I moved to strike the last word. I wanted to just speak to a couple of things. One, I thought that Mr. Morelli pointed out perfectly that $750 threshold essentially locks into place price setting by insurance companies. And the reason is that I have data from Washington State here, and this is publicly available data. Emergency room professional charges, 100% of them are below $750. None of those would qualify for a discussion between insurance companies and doctors. None would have the possibility of going to independent dispute resolution. With hospitalist professional charges, again, 100% of those are less than $750. Radiology charges, 99.7% of those are below $750. Lab pathology, 100% are below $750. And so it's an aggregate when you get these really big bills, which Mr. Morelli was pointing out, but this essentially allows the insurance companies to set prices. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that a lot of people are talking about independent dispute resolution as the solution. That's not the solution, that's the backstop. The solution is we protect the patients. We say patients only have to pay what they would pay in-network with their own insurance. The rest of it is just about whether we dictate the prices, the insurance companies dictate the prices, or whether we just let the doctors and the insurance companies work it out. And I think they should just work it out. We protect the patient either way. The last thing I wanted to point out was that there's a lot of talk about the CBO report and the CBO savings. And it sounds really good on the surface that there's a lot of savings. But I want to point out that when you dig into this, this is not savings for patients. This is savings for the government. And the point is that what happens is that those savings come from insurance companies paying out less, having bigger revenues, and paying more taxes. Again, sealing in that point that this really is an advantage for insurance companies. It's a disadvantage for rural hospitals, teaching hospitals, university hospitals, and the like. And the patients, they're protected either way equally with all of these bills. And so I support this amendment to get rid of the threshold. I yield back.
Anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? If not, the gentlelady from North Carolina have comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a report from Bloomberg Government headline, White House concerned about arbitration overuse in the House bill. And it talks about the White House closely monitoring the surprise medical billing legislation from the House Ways and Means Committee, as well as the Education and Labor Committee, and is concerned that a push to overuse arbitration will raise health care costs. I would like to put this in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And just in closing, I want to remind people why we're here. The surprise bill is not just a bill that comes technically out of network. It's a surprise because of its shocking size. Once we get the patient out, the question is, how much did insurance companies owe? And if they owe more, the employers are going to have to pay higher premiums. And if the insurance companies are paying more, the federal government is going to have to subsidize those higher premiums under the Affordable Care Act marketplace. We know that we keep hearing this thing called rate setting. It's not a rate set. We're acknowledging the negotiated fee of in-network rates. Those rates don't fall out of the sky. They're negotiated with the providers and the insurance companies. But we know as we inject more arbitration, there's going to be more uncertainty, which increases premiums. Arbitrations, they will end up in higher reimbursement rates, which increase costs, and higher administrative costs. We also know that we've been criticized already, as the ranking members pointed out, with too much arbitration. We know the insurance companies don't support this bill because there's too much arbitration. The consumer groups, patient groups, and labor groups have said that they can go with this because although there's arbitration, it's not that they can stand this little bit. But if this amendment is adopted, those letters of support we got point out that their support is conditioned on us with no amendments. Now we have the president criticizing arbitration, so if this amendment passes, we won't have a bill. Now, I understand that some just assume not have a bill, let the doctors send out these surprise bills, but if this bill passes, I can guarantee you that it will not go forward because of all of the opposition from insurance companies, labor, consumers, patient groups will all oppose the legislation. So I would hope that we would accept the compromise. We've gone as in much arbitration as these groups will stand. And if we adopt this amendment, there's no agreement at all. So I'd hope that we would defeat the amendment and pass the bill. With that, Dr. Fox, you withdraw your point of order?
I withdraw my reservation, Mr. Chairman.
With that, we will return to the, say again? We have to take a vote on the Morelli amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. Noes appear to have it. The recorded vote is requested. We will now return to the rolled votes, which would include row 45, striking the air ambulance service provisions. Row 47 changes median in-network to commercially reasonable rates. Row 48 changes median in-network to reasonably contracted rates. The Morelli Amendment, which we just debated, defeats the threshold for arbitration. And then final passage of the bill. Are there any questions? We will now consider roll call number 1, amendment number 7, row 45, strikes air ambulance service provisions. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mr. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no.
If the clerk could call the names of those that did not respond.
Ms. Fudge? Ms. Adams? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Walker? Mr. Wright?
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 8 yeas, 37 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is row 47, changes median in-network to commercially reasonable rates. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
No.
Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
If the clerk can call the name of those who did not respond.
Ms. Fudge? Ms. Adams? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no.
Have somebody stand behind her.
Mr. Byrne? Mr. Walker? Mr. Wright?
Anyone wish to change the vote?
Mr. Chairman, I need to change my vote to a yes.
Mrs. Lee votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 15 yeas, 30 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is row number 48, changes median in-network to reasonably contracted rate. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
No.
Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Gentlelady from, how is the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild?
Ms. Wild is not recorded. Ms. Wild votes aye.
Clerk report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 16 yeas, 29 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is Morelli deletes the threshold for arbitration. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Stefanik is recorded as no. Ms. Stefanik votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? How's Mr. Levin recorded?
Mr. Levin is not recorded. Mr. Levin votes no.
How is Ms. Omar recorded?
Ms. Omar is recorded as aye. Ms. Omar votes No.
Does anyone else wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 15 yeas, 30 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The next order of business is a vote on the amendment of nature of a substitute as amended. All in favor of the amendment of nature of a substitute as amended, vote aye. Aye. All opposed, vote no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment of nature of
Ask for a
substitute.
recorded vote.
Nature of a substitute is before us. You want one in final passage or the?
Final passage.
Okay. The, recognize Mr. Takano for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 5800 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
So motion to report the bill. All in favor will vote aye. 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 All opposed, vote no. Gentleman asked for a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? Get the vote screen up. Get it up on the screen. Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 32 yeas, 13 nays.
Thank you. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5800 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. Chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. Ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary and technical conforming changes to the bill as amended. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice to all members that they have the requisite number of days to file supplementary, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, it's so ordered. There's no further business before the committee. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.